Today we're out in the forest during a break in the rain taking a look at the vehicle that I've received probably the most requests for over the last few months, the all-new Cadillac XT4 crossover. This is Cadillac's smallest crossover in the US, and this is designed to compete in one of the hottest luxury segments going right now, the segment that also contains the BMW X1, X2, Audi Q3, Mercedes-Benz GLA, the all-new Volvo XC40, and of course the upcoming 2020 Range Rover Evoque as well. Some viewers were asking whether the XT4 was really targeted at this particular segment or whether it was intended to compete in the next segment up, where the X3, XC60, Q5, etc. compete. The answer is that Cadillac is definitely targeting this at the smaller segment, the subcompact crossover segment, even though this is a little bit on the large side for this particular group. The overall styling of the XT4 is instantly recognizable as a modern Cadillac. We have the LED light pipes running down the front right here that are very common in the Cadillac lineup, full LED headlamps right here on the inside, and they're nice and slim, which is definitely something that I like. We don't have fog lamps down at the bottom, but we do get some accent grills there and well-integrated parking sensors. The model that we're driving is the sport trim of the XT4, so we get some slight tweaks up front to the overall styling. We of course have a 360-degree camera right there underneath that Cadillac logo. And then Cadillac has done a really good job of hiding the radar adaptive cruise control sensor in the front bumper. Unlike the Cadillac sedan lineup in America, the XT4, XT5, and XT6 crossovers all start out their life as a front-wheel drive vehicle, with all-wheel drive being an option. This particular model does have that optional all-wheel drive system. Well, that may disappoint some shoppers in the larger categories where the XT5 and XT6 play. Down here in the XT4 category, that's actually not a problem because there are no rear-wheel drive entries in this smaller crossover luxury segment at the moment. The BMW X1, which was the lone holdout, is now a front-wheel drive based vehicle as well. And that really changes the way that the XT4 and any of the other competition ends up being compared to that particular BMW model. Now, one of the reasons that the XT4 has been confused as being in the next category up is its overall size. At 178.1 inches long, this is definitely on the long side for this category. But it is a notable 8 inches shorter than the Cadillac XT5. And the overall difference between the XT4 and XT5 is very similar to what we see in the competition's subcompact versus compact models. But you'll see that down there at the bottom of your screen, this is a full 10 inches longer than the Range Rover Evoque and a good 4 inches longer or so than the average in this category. Although this is not always the case, in the XT4's case right here, the greater exterior length does translate directly into greater interior space than we find in most of the competition. Most specifically legroom. We actually have a very generous amount of front and rear legroom in the XT4, especially versus the smaller entries in this segment. Be sure to let me know what you think about the overall design of this vehicle down there in the comment section below. I have to say that I have always liked the overall exterior design of Cadillac's modern vehicles. I like the angles going on here. The light pipes are well executed in the front and in the back over here. And the XT4 also has a nice muscular stance. You'll notice that the body really flares out right here around the rear wheel wells. It helps it look a little bit sportier. We also have dual exhaust tips well integrated in the bottom back here. And exhaust gases actually come out of those. That's something that we don't always see in European entries. At the moment, we find just one engine under here. It's a 2-liter 4-cylinder engine that produces 237 horsepower and 258 pound-feet of torque. This engine is a little bit different than the other 2 liters we find in Cadillac's engine lineup. This one features not only direct injection, but also cylinder deactivation in order to help improve overall fuel economy. The only transmission available is a 9-speed automatic that was developed in-house by General Motors themselves. So this 9-speed automatic is not related in any way to the 9-speed that we find under the hood of the Range Rover Evoque, certain Acura, and FCA products. This 9-speed automatic transmission is considerably smoother, as I've noted in reviews of other GM vehicles that receive this same automatic transmission. Now, this transmission is not quite as smooth as some of the competitors' 8-speed automatic transmissions, but generally speaking, this behaves and feels like a traditional automatic. As you'd expect out of a crossover, all-wheel drive is optional, and that will take your fuel economy down from 26 miles per gallon from the front-wheel drive model down to 24 miles per gallon if you choose the all-wheel drive option. An interesting touch with the all-wheel drive system under this body is that they actually included a sort of torque vectoring function right back here for the rear axle. This is very similar to, but not exactly the same thing that we see going on under modern Acura vehicles. General Motors tells us that this system does not have the ability to overdrive the rear axle. So assuming no front wheel slip, the most power that can go to the rear is 50%. but the vehicle can then send all that 50% to a single outside wheel whenever it needs to. It can do this to improve fuel economy by completely decoupling the rear axle entirely, or it can do it to improve overall driving dynamics by giving you a little bit of torque vectoring ability out in the corners. It's not going to be quite as aggressive as what we see in the Acura RDX, but it's definitely going to be more aggressive than we find in any of the competition in this particular segment. When it comes to front seat comfort, I'm going to give this model 9 out of 10 points. We are driving the top-end version, which offers a front seat massage feature, which is quite unique in this particular segment. Even some of the European options that offer massage in their upper-level models don't offer it in the competition to the XT4. We also have a power tilt telescopic steering column that is memory linked, another feature that we typically don't find at this end of the segment. A final nice touch in here is that the passenger seat has exactly the same range of motion as the driver's seat. We typically see this in American luxury cars and some of the European entries as well, but we generally don't see that in entries like the Lexus UX. Now, the passenger seat and the driver's seat are not quite as comfortable as some of the top-end trims of the competition, mainly because of the size of the overall seat bottom cushion. I found it a little bit short for my tastes, but I did love the fact that this has inflatable side cushions and again that massage functionality. Hopping into the back seat, you'll immediately notice that we have about 2 inches more combined legroom than we find in the average entry in this segment. And that means it's a lot more comfortable for adults to sit back here than some of those smaller options, especially like the Lexus UX, which is definitely on the low end of this segment as far as overall legroom is concerned. Now remember that this is not as wide as a compact luxury crossover, so if I move over to the middle seat, it's not going to be as comfortable for 3 folks across the back. Headroom is pretty generous back here overall for this segment, although my head does touch the ceiling. We are in the model with the panoramic roof. Now if I move over to the right side, you'll notice the effect of all this added legroom. This front seat is all the way back in its tracks. I had a 6'5" person very comfortably up there, and you can see I have a tiny bit of legroom left. I can just barely put my hand between my knees and the seat itself. Now on the downside, as you see on the chart on the side of your screen, overall headroom is a little bit below some of those squarer entries, so legroom is generous, but headroom could use a little bit of improvement. Rear passengers get a fold-down center armrest. This vehicle has heated rear seats. We also have a USB and a USB-C charge port right there, and the rear seats fold in a 60/40 fashion, completely flat with the cargo area in the back. When designing the XT4, Cadillac decided to favor overall interior passenger room over cargo capacity in the back. And that's why the overall cargo capacity back here is sort of mid-pack, even though the XT4 is again on the large side of this segment. Cadillac decided to use a rigid cargo cover. If I pull this out, you can see it right here. Instead of one of the roller type, this is a little bit less convenient to package around because you do have to put it somewhere if you're going to put cargo back here. And this is wider than the distance between the wheel wells. So you are left with doing something like that on the inside. Now this is going to be overall a little bit quieter than something like a roller cover, but not quite as convenient. Under the cargo area load floor, we do find some additional storage space, and in the middle, we actually find a spare tire, something that we don't find in all of the European competition. Now, the spare tire is one of the possible reasons that this cargo area is a little bit smaller than the competition, but I think even if you accounted for that extra volume taken up by the spare, this would still be notably smaller than something like the BMW X1. The model that we were able to test this week has the optional panoramic moonroof. You can see it's pretty large. It goes right over to just about the rear passenger's lap area right there. We have 2-way adjustable headrests up front and height adjustable shoulder belts. As we see in some of the other Cadillac models out there, we have some little chevrons right there on the seats to dress them up a little bit. It's a kind of a nice touch. And then if we move down the seat, you'll notice that the center sections in the seat back and seat bottom cushion are perforated because these seats are both heated and ventilated in this trim. I've seen a lot of commentary lately about the overall interior parts quality in the XT4 and that it wasn't meeting people's expectations. I was actually a little bit surprised by that because hopping in this cabin, I was actually impressed with this interior overall. I think it does very well for this segment. I definitely think this feels more premium in a lot of areas than we see in the new Lexus UX, for instance. Now we still find hard plastics at the bottom of the doors, just as you'd expect in a smaller category like the subcompact category, and perhaps this isn't quite as dressy as the carpeted panels that we find in the Volvo XC40, but I can't say that this overall feels cheaper. The doors and dashboard are dominated by stitched materials. We have carbon fiber trim in this particular model, but wood trim is also available. One thing I will mention is that this black on black interior is not exactly my favorite, but Cadillac does have a very attractive looking brown interior that I would probably get if I was XT4 shopping. On the passenger side, we have a bin style glove compartment. I had no problem fitting a standard iPad inside. The model that we're driving has the up-level sound system, so we have a center channel speaker right there above these two large air vents, and then we have a touchscreen infotainment system nestled here into the dashboard. As some of our Facebook fans pointed out, the overall styling of this infotainment screen reminds me a little bit of what we see in the Kia Stinger. We have this chrome band running right across this bezel, but this is not a pop-up tablet-style screen like we see in some of the competition. This is actually integrated into the dashboard. On the left side here, we have the power button, and then one thing I will point out, which some folks had a problem with, is that this same panel spans a dashboard that is squishy over here and then not squishy in these parts. Now again, personally, I don't have a problem with that because the overall feel of these materials is good, and then we have the stitching lines at the bottom which really dress it up. The infotainment system features Apple CarPlay and Android Auto integration, as you can see right there, in addition to optional factory navigation. There's a home button right down here at the bottom which takes us to the native menus within the system, and we can also control things like our climate control system right here within the touchscreen or with the physical buttons below. That physical button bank is a little reminiscent of some Mercedes models. They're combination toggles and simple buttons. So for instance, this is a simple button right here, but over here with the temperature, this actually toggles up and down. Same with the fan control right over there. Below that row of buttons, we have controls for the heated and ventilated seats, the automated parking system, park sensors, lane keeping assistance, and then the controls for the other side of the cabin. Below that button bank, we find two USB inputs. One of them is a newer USB-C style input, the SD card slot for the navigation database, 12-volt power port, but not quite enough room in here to stick some of the larger smartphones and still have this lid completely closed. The XT4 uses a new joystick-style shifter. We have a button right over here on the side that acts as the lock-unlock button. We toggle back for drive and then once more for manual mode. To the right of that, we have two fixed cup holders. There's no lid right there. There's some additional stitching on each side of this to help dress things up a little bit. And then we find the new controller for the Cadillac Q infotainment system. A nice touch with this system is that it is still a touchscreen-based system, but you can use this controller to work with some of the screens. Now, it's worth noting that because this is a recent addition to this software, things like the climate control screen, you can't actually interact with using this particular knob over here, but we can, for instance, interact with some of the audio system functions using this knob. There's a backup button, a dedicated phone button, dedicated button to take us over to the mapping interface, and then the power and volume knob is right over here, kind of like we see in some Audi products. To the right of that, we have a button to turn on and off the traction control system, the auto start-stop system. Some folks will be happy that you can actually disable that. And then we have the mode button over here that allows us to choose between Tour, all-wheel drive, and Sport. Between the front seats, we find a narrow padded armrest. This opens up to reveal a tiered storage compartment. We can actually remove this little tray right there, and then we find a deeper storage well in the middle. Keep in mind that because this is a narrower vehicle, obviously this is going to be narrower than something like the XT5. Over here we have a wireless charging mat for your smartphone. But keep in mind that this does not support wireless CarPlay or wireless Android Auto, so if you do want to use those smartphone engaged features, you do have to plug your smartphone into that storage area right up front. The model that we're driving features an instrument cluster with a larger color display than we find in the standard model, although the overall functionality remains just about the same. The model that we're driving has the optional heads-up display. Cadillac didn't go really too far outside their comfort zone with this particular system, so it operates basically the same as most other GM products. This doesn't, for instance, get the latest system that we see in some of their large pickup trucks. We do have infotainment readouts, turn-by-turn navigation directions, and a digital speedometer. The steering wheel is a chunky 3-spoke design with aggressive sport grips up top and a split bottom spoke right there. On the left side of the wheel, we find the buttons for the radar adaptive cruise control system. There's also a button to engage and disengage the optional steering wheel heating, a voice command button, and then a phone hang-up button right over there. On the right side, we have track up, down, volume up down here, and then this toggle area controls that multifunction LCD right between the speedometer and tachometer. From this angle, you can also see the shift paddles on the back of the steering wheel. We have down over here on the left and then up on the right. When it comes to acceleration, the XT4 feels a little bit faster than it actually is. That's because this 9-speed automatic transmission has a pretty aggressive first gear ratio, and that really helps get this vehicle off the line. We see something very similar in vehicles like the Acura RDX and the Acura MDX, and it really has a positive impact on the overall feeling of performance. Now, when it comes to actual 0 to 60 times, this vehicle ran to that number in 7.5 seconds, which is a little bit slower than the average in this particular segment. It definitely is nowhere near as quick as the recently announced BMW X2 with their available 300 horsepower engine. Most of the European entries in this segment at least have an option in the 250 to 260 horsepower range, and this is a little bit below that. But this is going to be notably faster than something like the Lexus UX, which is definitely on the slow side for this luxury segment. Well, we're talking about the 9-speed automatic. As I said before, this is not the same transmission that we find under the hood of the Range Rover Evoque. That one is made by ZF of Germany. We see it under the hood of the Range Rover, certain Acura models. We also see it under certain Honda models, and of course vehicles from FCA like Jeep. That transmission is not terribly smooth. There are some definite funky shifts going on, but this 9-speed is actually an in-house General Motors design. It was shared by Ford, but Ford decided to remove a gear and use it as an 8-speed in some of their newer vehicles. The big thing to note is that this does not have the same kind of clutches that the ZF transmission has, which are the root of that transmission's odd shift behavior. So this always feels like a pretty traditional automatic. Admittedly, an automatic with a ton of gears. So it feels like this transmission is constantly shifting. The shifts are also a little bit more crisp than we find in a lot of the competition, so sends it feeling a little bit like a dual clutch transmission. A lot of folks that I had in the car this week thought that it was a dual clutch, but it's not. It's actually a traditional 9-speed auto. Now, it is worth noting that overall this transmission is not as smooth as the Aisin 8-speed automatic that we find under the hood of the BMW and the Volvo competition. That transmission just appears to be better at selecting the right gear, especially when you're driving the vehicle a little bit harder out on the road. Speaking of driving the vehicle a little bit more spiritedly, let's talk about handling now. This vehicle is the only entry in this segment that has any kind of mechanical torque vectoring going on in the back. But this torque vectoring system is not like what we see under the rear end of Acura models. Acura vehicles can overdrive the rear axle, send more than 50% of engine power to the rear axle or to a single rear wheel, even when there is no slip going on up front. This system cannot do that, and that's why General Motors generally tries to shy away from the torque vectoring description for this system, because they like to follow the SAE rules in naming things, and according to the SAE, if the rear axle is not overdriven versus the front, then you can't call it torque vectoring. Basically, this is the same system that we see under the hood and under the body of the Chevy Blazer. It is definitely more capable than a system that does not have the ability to send power across the rear axle, but because it will never overdrive one of those rear wheels, it's not technically the same as what we find under the hood and under the body of the Acura RDX, for instance. The RDX can feel like a rear-wheel drive vehicle, and it's noticeable in corners like we're going over right here. If you were to give that RDX a little bit more gas, it would actually tend to kick out the rear of the vehicle a little bit, and we don't see that in the XT4. In addition to that, General Motors is definitely erring on the side of fuel economy for this all-wheel drive system overall. Now, the front-wheel drive nature of the XT4 really isn't a problem in this segment because everybody is front-wheel drive as well, including the BMW and the Range Rover entries. So overall dynamics, this is actually basically the same as the BMW X1 and X2. Although the X1 and X2 are a little bit more polished than we find here. They're a little bit more direct feeling, especially in the overall steering feedback to the driver, and they just feel a little bit tighter and a little bit lighter on their feet. Curb weight has something to do with that. This is the largest entry in this segment, so it shouldn't be a surprise that this is the heaviest as well. This weighs nearly 4,000 pounds. This is about 200 to 300 pounds heavier than the direct competition from Europe, and it definitely feels a little bit heavier out on the road. But Cadillac is a brand that has definitely long been known for excellent handling dynamics, so they've really done a pretty good job at masking that extra weight in the XT4. The model that we've been driving this week is the sport trim of the XT4, which has a firmer suspension, some slightly different tires and wheels going on, and then the model that we're driving has the optional adaptive suspension system as well. The adaptive suspension is a nice touch in this segment where not every luxury entry offers that particular option. It helps firm things up when you're really driving the car in a more spirited fashion, and of course it helps soften things out when you want a more comfortable ride as well. When it comes to our overall scores, I'm going to give the handling section an A- and the ride section an A for this segment. The added weight and the added size of this vehicle definitely help the ride feel a little bit softer, but that added weight does have a negative impact on the overall handling ability, and the torque vectoring function in the rear just can't compensate that much for it. In some ways, this actually feels a little bit more like the Acura RDX or the Cadillac XT5 than the average European entry in this segment. Again, it definitely feels a little bit more substantial out on the road. That's not necessarily a bad thing depending on what you're looking for, because the overall grip levels are still pretty good. In our cabin noise test at 50 miles an hour, we clocked 70 decibels in here, which makes this one of the quieter entries in this segment. Now, we do get a little bit more engine noise into the cabin than we see in some of the competition, but road noise and wind noise are very, very well controlled. In our fuel economy test, we've averaged 25.5 miles per gallon over a week of mixed driving in this model. That's actually a little bit higher than the overall EPA score for this all-wheel drive trim, likely because this vehicle does deactivate the all-wheel drive system every time you start the vehicle, and that will seriously improve your overall fuel economy. As we see in some of GM's latest all-wheel drive products, this has the ability to completely decouple the all-wheel drive system. A lot of older vehicles out there, even when the clutch pack in the center was disconnected, the rear axle was still providing a little bit more drag than some of the alternatives. This vehicle can open the clutch pack in the rear, open the clutch pack in the front, and basically freewheel, so that way the number of spinning parts in there is greatly reduced, and that helps improve the overall fuel efficiency, especially in long-distance highway travel. At this point in time, we haven't heard whether there will be a hybrid or a plug-in hybrid version of the XT4, so if you want better fuel economy in this segment, at the moment you have relatively few options. We have the hybrid UX250H, which is not exactly sporty, but it will get excellent fuel economy, and then we have the upcoming plug-in hybrids from some of the European alternatives. Out on the road, I kept drawing parallels between this XT4 and the Audi Q3 and the Volvo XC40. The main reason for that is that in the next category up from this, the XT5, XC60, Q5, etc., these brands give up a little bit in terms of overall driving dynamics inherent in the way that the vehicle is designed to something like the BMW X3. But that's not the case down here in this particular segment. Everybody is playing on a more equal footing. And therefore, the overall driving dynamics of the vehicles are an awful lot closer together. In terms of general driving dynamics, this really is not that far off of the BMW X1 because it too is a front-wheel drive vehicle with a 2-liter turbo under the hood, driving the front wheels by default. Now that the BMW X1 is not a rear-wheel drive vehicle anymore, all the vehicles in this group are on a more equal footing in that respect. There's still obviously some nuances and differences between them. For instance, this Cadillac is a little bit larger feeling, a little bit more comfortable, a little bit more numb in terms of the overall steering feel, but the vehicles are again definitely more similar than they have been in the past. With the base price under $35,000, the XT4 is right in line with the mainline competition from Europe in terms of overall starting price. But if you get carried away with options, it can get quite expensive for this category, up to about $57,000 for the model that we were driving. That means that overall, the XT4 can get more expensive than many of its mainline European competitors, with very few exceptions. The first and obviously most direct of those competitors is the BMW X1, the best-selling entry in this segment. It's really not hard to see why BMW sells so many X1s. It's relatively well priced, starting at $34,950. It doesn't get quite as expensive as the XT4 either, helping people keep their budget in check. And the XT4 has a very generously sized interior. It actually has more cargo room than we find in the XT4, even though the XT4 is overall a larger vehicle. And the interior is very comfortable and very much like the rest of the BMW lineup. The BMW is really just sort of the Honda Accord of this segment. It's hard to go wrong with this particular choice. If you want a little bit more sport injected into things, then you can get the BMW X2, which is the sleeker, more expensive, and less practical version of the X1. You give up a little bit of cargo space and a little bit of rear passenger room for a sexier overall profile and the ability to get a more powerful engine. But it is worth noting that even that BMW X2 with that more powerful engine could be less expensive than a top-end trim of the Cadillac. Although neither of the BMWs offers the mechanical rear torque vectoring system that we find in the XT4, overall handling is actually very, very good in the BMW lineup, just as you'd expect out of that brand. But the big win isn't actually grip for the BMW, it's overall steering feel, because the two will actually hold the road just about the same. Some of the top-end price difference can be explained away in the available features that we find in the Cadillac versus the BMW, like we have those massaging front seats that we had in our tester that you won't find in the BMW. But even if you exclude some of those options, the Cadillac is going to be about a few $1,000s more expensive than the BMW. Next up, we have the Volvo XC40, one of our favorites in this segment. It starts just under $34,000 for the base T4 trim. Now, you're going to get a lot less power in that model than we find in the Cadillac, but as we see in the BMW, once you start ratcheting your way up the Volvo lineup, it actually can be less expensive than the Caddy. The Volvo really excels when it comes to overall space efficiency. It's pretty obvious when you look at the form. The XC40 is shaped kind of like a brick. And that's how, even though it's 7 inches shorter than the Cadillac, we only lose about 3 inches of legroom, and the cargo area is about the same size. Despite the torque vectoring axle in the Cadillac, overall handling is not quite as sharp as what we see in the Volvo, and that really surprises because the Volvo is quite high off the ground at 8.3 inches of overall clearance. Even though the Cadillac has a torque vectoring axle that we don't find in the Volvo, overall handling is actually a little bit sharper in the Volvo XC40. As I said in the drive section, no one manufacturer really has handling in this segment cornered, because the BMW used to be a rear-wheel drive entry in this segment, but they've moved to front-wheel drive, giving nobody a clear advantage in terms of overall dynamics. The result of that is that even though I prefer the way the BMW and the Volvo handle in this segment, the reality is that none of these entries are very far from one another. Next up, we have the Audi Q3, one of the value entries in this segment at $32,900. Audi has priced the Q3 very aggressively, but on the flip side, it is actually one of the smallest entries in the segment, with considerably less legroom than we find in the XT4. In fact, the difference in legroom between the XT4 and the Q3 is larger than the difference that we find between the average in the subcompact segment and the next group of compact vehicles larger than this. The Q3 does well when it comes to the overall gadget score because Audi has dropped all of their latest infotainment technologies into the cabin of the Q3, but under the hood things are actually a little bit old for this segment. It uses a 6-speed automatic transmission rather than an 8 or a 9-speed, which is more typical in this group now. Heading over to England, we have the Jaguar E-Pace. We're going to talk about this one because not all of the details of the upcoming Range Rover Evoque are out just yet. The Evoque and the E-Pace are very closely related, however. Generally speaking, the Jaguar and the Range Rover are considered the more premium entries in this group of vehicles. And you can really see that on the inside, where the Jaguar has a nicer interior than we find in most of the base competition. But you'll definitely pay for that because the overall starting price is notably higher even in the base model. And if you get carried away with options, you can get on just about as high as the XT4 as well. Jaguar does offer more power than other manufacturers in this group as well, up to 296 horsepower with their new 4-cylinder line of engines and a 9-speed automatic transmission. But don't get too excited because the E-Pace and of course the upcoming related Range Rover Evoque are actually quite heavy for this segment, up to 400 to 500 pounds heavier than the Cadillac, the BMW, or the Volvo. And there you have it. That's been our look at the 2019 Cadillac XT4. Be sure and let me know what you would choose if your own money was on the line down there in the comment section below. I really like the XT4. I like the way that it drives. I like the way that it looks. I love the feature content on the inside, but I have to say, I wish it was $5,000 to $7,000 less expensive. If it actually managed to get to that lower price point, then this would be a really good deal in this segment, and I would strongly recommend it. Unfortunately, at the price point that we're seeing right here, I have to say that I would choose the BMW X1, X2, or XC40 before the XT4 right here. Overall pricing is likely going to be lower at the dealer, so if you manage to get that much off of your XT4, then I would say go for it. If not, I would say look at some of the other options in this segment.